Good day to you guys, gals, and enby pals. My name is Andrude. Grief is a funny thing, isn't it? Most people say it takes place over 7 stages, and while the truth of that universality is debatable, today I'm sticking to the old reliable model as I continue to mourn the loss of my dearly beloved Mario 3D All-Stars, making my way right through Stage 3. Around the time Super Mario 3D All-Stars was announced, the channel Video Game Storytime published a video arguing why the game's limited time availability was a case of need rather than greed, and quite honestly, I found myself strongly disagreeing with the majority of the points they put forward. So like any reasonable individual would, I thought it'd be fun to go through their video today and explain why I believe their arguments are invalid.
The timing of the release of 3D All-Stars is not unlike the NES Classic, a similar package of classic Nintendo games. When asked after the fact why Nintendo didn't continue manufacturing the product indefinitely, Reggie Fils-Aimé stated, "We had originally planned for this to be a product for last holiday."
This is the first point raised by the video, detailing an interview conducted by Time Magazine's Matt Peckham and then President of Nintendo of America, Reggie Fils-Aimé. In the piece, Reggie more or less explains the above, that although the NES Classic was wildly successful and notoriously tricky to get a hold of, Nintendo didn't want to allocate more resources to its production and thus axed it off. Although this thinking makes sense in a bubble, it quickly falls apart the minute you mull over the CEO's reasoning. For starters, look at the NES Classic. It amounts to little more than a Raspberry Pi in a plastic case, complete with a controller rocking not even a meter of connecting cable. Although these are certainly still resources, and resources that one could argue would be better put to use elsewhere in the company, the device is far less complicated than, say, the 3DS, which had an updated model announced the day before the interview in the form of the new 2DS XL, despite the fact that although seeing somewhat of a resurgence the previous year, 3DS system sales run a steady decline, and the Switch had demonstrably proved itself a success, having moved almost 20 million units at the time of the interview, despite stock issues, and having only been on store shelves for about 2 months at the time. But speaking of stock issues, that's another vital aspect to consider. The NES Classic's aforementioned chronic unavailability was to such a ludicrous degree that to label it a case of Nintendo simply underestimating the demand for its product would frankly be an insult to the intelligence of those overseeing its production.
For an idea of just how utterly pathetic the situation was, my local Target had 3, not 30, not 300, 3 NES Classics to sell on launch day. This is according to my sources at said Target, who I refer to only as the damned and the fucking forsaken. In totality, since release, that local Target has received an incredible 5 NES Classics. Retailers around the country have informed multiple outlets that they all received stock in the single digits, less than 10 apiece.
Nintendo has a pretty well documented history of creating a sense of scarcity for its products, and nowhere is this better exemplified than with my next point.
A similar sentiment was expressed by Satoru Iwata when discussing early amiibo shortages, when he said, "We are very sorry that we can't promise at what point we will likely be able to resolve the current situation, because figures such as these require a considerable amount of time to produce."
My refutations here are mostly the same as those raised in defense of the NES Classic. Amiibo shortages were just as bad as the lacking retro console stock, and I feel labeling it a simple case of incompetence would be inadequate.
This is exactly what happened with the Amiibo. In fact, using the Target Forsaken as a source again, I can say Nintendo deliberately undersold certain Amiibo to falsify a scarcity. Stores would get a box load of some characters, but only 4 bloody Marths, and similarly predetermined popular characters, to create that artifice of rarity. And that's what it is, artifice. Pre-planned, manufactured, thoroughly contrived rarity.
Nintendo's plays here are pretty much identical to that of the Walt Disney Companies with its notorious Disney Vault, where the film giant would restrict access to home versions of their films to ensure that whenever they were available, they would sell. Well, that's another aspect Nintendo seems to have borrowed from the House of Mouse.
Nintendo can be left with situations like the early years of the 3DS and the Wii U, where sales simply don't match up with demand.
Okay, this part is just insulting, because much like the best lies, it is based on a kernel of truth. Although yes, both the 3DS and Wii U had a historically poor launch, this was the result of a high price point and a lack of compelling software, not an overstock of consoles. As was made evident when the 3DS exploded in popularity when Nintendo announced both a permanent 68% price reduction as well as a slew of upcoming hotly anticipated first-party software. The Wii U never emulated this success because, well,
because 2020 is that kind of year, Nintendo's manufacturing and distribution has been severely hindered.
That phrase, 2020's just been that kind of year. What in God's green name are you talking about? I mean, yes, 2020 was a nuclear dumpster fire of a year, but in what way does that impact Nintendo's ability to manufacture Switch cartridges? Were there shortages of other Nintendo Switch games that I just didn't know about? Animal Crossing New Horizons also came out in 2020, and to my knowledge, there were no problems just waltzing on into your local GameSmart and grabbing one off the shelf should you be so inclined. Hell, Mario 3D All-Stars was shockingly available! At least after the initial wave of FOMO hysteria died down, itself only created by Nintendo's announcement of its imminent death!
A temporary, limited print run for a game allows the company a quick win over the holiday season, but won't overstay its welcome should Nintendo come up with another plan for these classic games in 2021 or beyond.
That's your big argument? We should just trust Nintendo has a plan for people to buy this game after it's unavailable? Ooh. No! That's a terrible idea! First off, I don't know what Nintendo you're talking about that we should trust they'll have anything resembling a reasonable plan of action for those looking to get this game after they decide it won't be available anymore, but... I mean, can they be real Nintendo instead? Potentially misplaced trust issues aside, who cares if Nintendo restricts access to this game for a day, a week, a year, a forever? The point is, by creating a product and saying exactly for how long we'll be able to purchase said product, Nintendo is directly manipulating the market by creating a sense of scarcity for its products. And this isn't even just borderline certain intentional scarcity like with the previously mentioned examples, this is Nintendo quite literally creating demand by announcing an arbitrary expiration date on sales of its games. Well, seemingly arbitrary, anyway. I will say that Nintendo's fiscal year just happens to end on March 31st. Not only the same death day of 3D All-Stars, but of Super Mario 35 and the English version of Fire Emblem, Shadow Dragon, and the Blade of Light. Now, I'm not saying that Nintendo's decision to halt sales of these games on this day in particular was in any way motivated by a last-minute means of beefing up what was a potentially underperforming fiscal year, but...
Why doesn't Nintendo simply extend the game's availability further into next year? Nintendo's lawyers get very antsy when the company considers extending the availability of something they've previously insisted will only be available for a short time. Satoru Iwata was once asked about a special limited edition Fire Emblem package that was available in Japan. The game's chaotic and unpredictable availability led to frustration. He failed to anticipate the demand for such kind of special package deal of the Nintendo 3DS hardware, decorated with a certain video game character on its surface, and the software. We actually considered if we could change the sales method to something different afterward. According to an outside attorney, however, those who had purchased it at the beginning might complain if they had bought it just because it was a limited edition.
Alright, so let me get this straight. Let me see if I'm picking up what you're putting down. You're arguing that the reason Nintendo is using limited edition now on its packaging, like that term specifically, is because they used it in the past and they weren't happy with the results because they noticed that they had understocked their consoles and it made their fans upset. But because they called it limited edition, they couldn't just make more or extend how it was available. And because they weren't happy with this form of marketing, they used it again on 3D All-Stars.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But let's say, for the sake of argument, that everything you've just said is 100% correct. That Nintendo has to label 3D All-Stars a limited edition release to avoid a definitely real oversupply issue. And if they either extend its availability, or heaven forfend, just make it always available like a normal game, they would be in violation of Japan's law for preventing unjustifiable extra or unexpected benefit and misleading representation. Okay then. What about the eShop? Or their Nintendo World Store in Rockefeller Center? My point is, if not taking up third-party shelf space is really the primary reasoning behind its decision, Nintendo has ample distribution channels for which it doesn't need to spend a thin dime. Hell, with the eShop, you can't even argue it's a matter of manufacturing woes because all you're selling is a license for users to access a file on their consoles. This video's bullshit! All of the arguments raised, in addition to simply being flimsy at best, were related to hardware. And while their unavailability level is ludicrous enough as is, 3D All-Stars is software, for which the manufacturing and distribution process is inherently different, and for which Nintendo has many more avenues through which it can distribute its products. Video Game Storytime made a video called Why Mario is Italian, and it's fun, and it's light, and it's full of fun facts about the creation of Nintendo's icon. And I think you should check it out, because it's informative, and it's entertaining, and it's not apologetic for the scummy actions of a century-old corporation, and fuck this video!